What if a single war could redraw the map of the world, topple empires, and leave scars that still shape our lives today? World War II wasn't just the largest conflict in history, it was a storm of ambition, betrayal, and unimaginable loss that pulled in nations from every corner of the globe. Behind the headlines in history books, there are stories of secret deals, shocking reversals, and choices that changed the fate of millions in a matter of days. How did a world still reeling from one devastating war find itself hurtling toward an even greater catastrophe? The answer isn't as simple as a single villain or a single spark. Instead, it's a tangled web of resentment, desperation, and ambition where every decision seemed to push the world closer to the edge. As we retrace the path to war, you'll see how old grudges, economic chaos, and the rise of ruthless leaders set the stage for a conflict that would engulf continents. But beneath the surface, there were hidden motives and secret alliances, with each move on the global chessboard bringing new dangers. The story of World War II is more than just battles and dates. It's a tale of how humanity's darkest moments can unleash both destruction and resilience. And as we peel back the layers, you'll discover the untold stories and shocking twists that made this war unlike anything the world had ever seen. But before the first shot was fired, the seeds of chaos had already been planted, and the world was about to change forever. The end of World War I was supposed to bring peace, but instead, it planted the seeds for an even greater disaster. Germany, battered and broken, was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a humiliation that stung deep and lingered for years. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just redraw borders, it carved up entire empires, erasing the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman realms from the map and handing over German territories to the victors. For millions, this wasn't just a loss of land, it was a loss of identity, pride, and hope. The new borders created fresh tensions, especially in places like Poland, which was reborn from the ruins but surrounded by enemies on all sides. Meanwhile, Germany was saddled with a debt so massive that many believed it could never be repaid. The country's economy spiraled into chaos, with money losing value by the day and families watching their life savings turn to dust. Hyperinflation hit so hard that people needed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The sense of injustice and betrayal simmered, fueling anger and resentment that would soon find a voice in dangerous new movements. Across Europe, the collapse of old powers left a vacuum, and uncertainty spread like wildfire. People who had survived one war now faced a future filled with poverty, instability, and fear. In this climate of desperation, radical ideas began to take root, and the world unknowingly edged closer to another catastrophe. But the true breaking point was yet to come, as economic disaster would soon push entire nations to the brink. As the 1920s faded, the world was already on shaky ground, but nothing could prepare people for the economic earthquake that was about to hit. In Germany, the scars of war, debt, and hyperinflation had barely begun to heal when the Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the globe. Suddenly, banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, and millions found themselves out of work almost overnight. The Great Depression didn't just devastate the United States, it spread like a virus, infecting every major economy and plunging entire populations into poverty and despair. In Germany, the unemployment rate soared, and the middle class, once the backbone of society, watched their dreams crumble. People lined up for hours just to get a piece of bread, and the sense of hopelessness was everywhere. In this climate of desperation, extremist voices grew louder, promising simple solutions to impossible problems. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized the moment, feeding off the anger and fear that gripped the nation. They blamed outsiders, minorities, and the so-called traitors of the old government for Germany's suffering, and their message found a willing audience among those who felt abandoned by the world. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime tightened its grip, using propaganda and violence to silence opposition and rally the country around dreams of lost glory. Across Europe, democracy seemed fragile, and the promise of strong leadership, no matter how ruthless, became dangerously appealing. The stage was set for a new kind of politics, one built on division, hatred, and the promise of revenge. But as these radical movements gained power, the world had no idea just how far they would go or how quickly everything would spiral out of control. And soon, the ambitions of these leaders would push the world to the very edge. As the 1930s unfolded, the world watched with growing unease as old alliances fractured and new, dangerous partnerships began to form. In the shadows of Europe, secret deals and backroom negotiations set the stage for a wave of aggression that would soon sweep across continents. Germany, now under Hitler's iron rule, openly defied the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding its military and dreaming of uniting all German-speaking people under one flag. The world's leaders issued warnings, but their words rang hollow as Germany's ambitions grew bolder. Meanwhile, Italy, led by Mussolini's fascist regime, nursed its own grievances. Despite fighting alongside the Allies in World War I, Italy felt cheated by the meager rewards it received. Determined to restore its former glory, Mussolini launched brutal campaigns in Africa, seizing Ethiopia and setting his sights on Albania. These acts of aggression sent a clear message. The old order was crumbling, and the rules no longer applied. But Europe wasn't the only region on the brink. In Spain, a bloody civil war erupted, pitting the Republican government backed by the Soviet Union and international volunteers against the nationalist forces led by Francisco Franco, who received support from both Germany and Italy. This conflict became a testing ground for new weapons and tactics, as well as a diplomatic rehearsal for the alliances that would soon dominate the world stage. Farther east, Japan pursued its own expansionist dreams, taking advantage of China's internal chaos to seize new territories. The Japanese military unleashed a wave of violence, using chemical and biological weapons and committing atrocities that shocked the world. Though few dared to intervene, as these aggressive moves unfolded, the world's major powers hesitated, hoping that appeasement and diplomacy might prevent another global catastrophe. But behind closed doors, new alliances were being forged. Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn enemies in ideology, shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact, secretly agreeing to carve up Eastern Europe between them. The stage was set for a conflict unlike any before, with each nation maneuvering for advantage and preparing for the storm they all sensed was coming. And as the world held its breath, the first dominoes began to fall, setting off a chain reaction that would soon engulf the globe. When the storm finally broke, it was swift and merciless. Germany, now a military powerhouse, unleashed a new kind of warfare that stunned the world: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't the slow, grinding conflict of the past. Instead, it was a relentless assault of tanks, planes, and troops, moving with terrifying speed, overwhelming defenses, before anyone could react. The first target was Poland. In September 1939, German forces surged across the border, and within weeks, the country was carved up between Germany and the Soviet Union, as agreed in their secret pact. The world watched in shock as the United Kingdom and France declared war, but their response was cautious, almost hesitant. While German troops focused on the east, the Allies tried to cut off Germany's vital supply of iron ore from Norway, but their efforts fell short. In a matter of days, Germany struck back, invading Denmark and Norway, then sweeping through Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium with barely a pause. The speed and ferocity of the German advance left Europe reeling. French defenses, built for a different kind of war, crumbled under the pressure. British forces, caught off guard, were forced into a desperate retreat, evacuating from the beaches of Dunkirk in a dramatic escape that saved thousands but left the continent in German hands. Paris fell, and France was forced to sign a humiliating armistice. The country was split in two. Germany occupied the north and west, while a puppet government controlled the rest, its colonies now under indirect Nazi influence. Yet, even as the swastika flew over Paris, resistance flickered to life. In London, General Charles de Gaulle rallied Free France, vowing to fight on, while parts of the French colonies and the Belgian Congo refused to surrender. Meanwhile, the Axis powers tightened their grip. Italy joined Germany and Japan in a formal alliance, and the Soviet Union, honoring its deal with Hitler, seized the Baltic states and parts of Romania. Across Europe, fear and uncertainty spread as one nation after another fell or was forced to choose sides. The world had never seen such rapid conquest, and it seemed as if nothing could stop the Axis advance. But beneath the surface, resistance was growing, and the seeds of a global fightback were already being sown. The question on everyone's mind: how long could this darkness last before the world found the strength to fight back? As Europe buckled under the weight of German domination, the conflict refused to stay contained. The war's reach stretched far beyond the continent, igniting battles and alliances that would draw in nearly every corner of the globe. In the east, the Soviet Union, having seized the Baltic states and a slice of Romania under its pact with Germany, watched uneasily as Hitler's ambitions grew. But the uneasy truce wouldn't last. In June 1941, Germany shattered the agreement with a massive surprise attack on the USSR Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion in history, with millions of troops pouring across the border. The Soviets, caught off guard, suffered devastating losses. But the brutal Russian winter and fierce resistance would soon turn the tide. Meanwhile, the world's attention shifted to the Pacific, where Japan's hunger for resources and territory pushed it into direct conflict with Western powers. Japan's expansion had already left a trail of devastation across China and Southeast Asia, but the stakes rose dramatically when the United States imposed an embargo on oil and steel, threatening to choke Japan's war machine. In response, Japan launched a bold and shocking attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet and dragging America into the war. Suddenly, the conflict was truly global. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial might, joined the Allies, shifting the balance of power. Fierce battles erupted across the Pacific, from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the South Pacific, as Japan sought to expand its empire and the Allies fought to push them back. But the horrors of war weren't limited to the front lines. In both Europe and Asia, atrocities mounted. The Nazi regime constructed a network of concentration and extermination camps, unleashing a campaign of terror against Jews, resistance fighters, and countless others. In Asia, Japan forced millions into brutal labor camps and committed acts of violence that would haunt survivors for generations. The world was now locked in a struggle not just for territory, but for survival itself. As the Axis powers tightened their grip, resistance movements sprang up in occupied countries, sabotaging supply lines, gathering intelligence, and keeping hope alive. The war had become a battle of wills, with every nation forced to choose a side and every day bringing new horrors and new acts of courage. And as the conflict raged on, the question remained, could the Allies find a way to turn the tide, or would the world be lost to darkness? Just when it seemed the Axis powers were unstoppable, the tide of war began to shift in ways no one could have predicted. The first cracks appeared on the Eastern Front, where the German advance into the Soviet Union ground to a halt outside Moscow. The brutal Russian winter, combined with fierce Soviet resistance, turned what was supposed to be a swift victory into a nightmare of frozen trenches and staggering losses. In Leningrad, the city endured a siege that lasted nearly 900 days, with over 1 million civilians perishing from starvation and relentless bombardment. Yet, the city refused to fall, and the Soviets slowly began to push back, launching counterattacks that would eventually drive the invaders into retreat. The resilience of the Soviet people became a symbol of hope for the entire Allied cause. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Allies launched daring operations to wrest control from Axis forces. British and Commonwealth troops, joined by American reinforcements, clashed with Rommel's famed Afrika Korps in a series of brutal battles across the desert. The turning point came at El Alamein, where Allied forces finally broke through, forcing the Axis into a desperate retreat. With North Africa secured, the Allies set their sights on Italy, launching an invasion from Sicily that toppled Mussolini's regime and forced Italy to switch sides. But the Germans responded with a fierce occupation, turning the Italian campaign into a grinding, bloody struggle that would last until the war's end. Back in Western Europe, the Allies prepared for their most ambitious operation yet, the liberation of France. On June 6, 1944, DDAS soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy under a hail of gunfire, braving mines, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. The cost was staggering, but the invasion succeeded, opening a new front and forcing Germany to fight on multiple sides. Paris was liberated within months, and the momentum of the war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements grew bolder, sabotaging railways, gathering intelligence, and launching uprisings that further weakened the Axis grip. The world watched as the seemingly invincible Nazi war machine began to crumble, and hope returned to millions who had lived under the shadow of occupation. But as the Allies pressed forward, the final battles would prove to be the most brutal yet, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance as the Allies closed in from all sides. The final year of World War II became a desperate race against time, marked by chaos, destruction, and choices that would haunt humanity forever. In the East, the Soviet Red Army surged forward with unstoppable force, liberating city after city as they pushed the battered German army back toward Berlin. The cost was staggering: entire towns reduced to rubble, millions of civilians caught in the crossfire, and a trail of devastation that stretched from Stalingrad to the heart of Germany. In the West, Allied forces pressed through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, liberating countries that had suffered under years of occupation. The German military, once feared as invincible, now found itself fighting on two fronts, outnumbered and outgunned. With morale crumbling and resources running dry, Inside Germany, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Hitler, isolated in his Berlin bunker, refused to accept defeat, issuing impossible orders as his inner circle collapsed around him. The city itself became a battlefield, with Soviet troops fighting street by street in a brutal siege that left nothing untouched. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, Hitler took his own life, and within days, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But even as Europe celebrated the end of Nazi tyranny, the war was far from over in the Pacific. The United States and the Soviet Union now turned their full attention to Japan, which continued to resist despite mounting losses and the destruction of its cities by relentless bombing raids. In a move that would change the course of history, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, the other on Nagasaki, unleashing devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. The decision remains one of the most controversial in history, with debates still raging over whether it was necessary to end the war or simply a show of power. The impact was immediate and horrifying, with tens of thousands killed in an instant and countless more suffering in the aftermath. Faced with the combined might of the Allies and the threat of further destruction, Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945. The world had witnessed the unthinkable. A war that began with tanks and rifles ended with the dawn of the nuclear age. The cost was almost beyond comprehension: cities in ruins, families shattered, and a death toll that reached into the tens of millions. But as the guns fell silent, a new and uncertain era was about to begin. When the dust finally settled, the world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was almost unrecognizable. The scale of destruction was staggering. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble, and the death toll reached at least 60 million, with civilians making up the majority of the victims. In Europe, the scars ran deep. Germany and Austria were carved up among the victors, their territories divided into zones controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Millions of German prisoners of war were forced into labor, many never returning home. The old European empires, once the center of global power, were left exhausted and bankrupt, their influence fading as new forces rose to fill the void. Amid the ruins, the world's leaders gathered to try to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The United Nations was born out of this hope, a new international body designed to keep the peace and foster cooperation. But even as the ink dried on the UN Charter, it was clear that peace would not come easily. The alliance that had defeated the Axis powers quickly began to fracture, as deep ideological differences surfaced between the United States and the Soviet Union. The world was now divided into 2 rival camps, each armed with new and terrifying weapons, and each determined to shape the future according to its own vision. The Cold War had begun, and with it came a new era of suspicion, proxy wars, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. For millions of people, the end of the war did not bring immediate relief. Refugees wandered across shattered landscapes, searching for lost family members and a place to call home. In Eastern Europe, new regimes backed by the Soviet Union took hold, while in the West, countries struggled to rebuild their economies and societies. The horrors of the Holocaust and other war crimes were exposed to the world, leading to the first international trials for crimes against humanity. Yet, even as justice was sought, the trauma of the war lingered, shaping the lives of survivors and the policies of nations for generations to come. The world had changed forever, and the struggle to find peace and stability in this new order was only just beginning. But as nations rebuilt and new alliances formed, one question remained: could humanity learn from the past, or was another conflict already waiting on the horizon? World War II didn't just end with treaties and surrenders, it left a legacy that still echoes through every corner of our world. The scars of the conflict are etched into the landscapes of Europe and Asia, where entire cities had to be rebuilt from the ground up and generations grew up in the shadow of loss. The war's aftermath forced humanity to confront the darkest depths of cruelty and the heights of resilience. The stories of survivors, resistance fighters, and ordinary people who endured the unimaginable became a testament to the human spirit's ability to persevere, even when hope seemed lost. Yet, the lessons of World War II are as complex as the war itself. The creation of the United Nations was a bold attempt to forge a new path for global cooperation, but the world quickly found itself divided once again, this time by the Iron Curtain of the Cold War. The nuclear age, born in the final days of the conflict, introduced a new kind of fear, one where the fate of millions could be decided in an instant. The war also forced nations to reckon with the horrors of genocide, leading to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the first international trials for crimes against humanity. But even as the world vowed never again, new conflicts and atrocities would test that promise. The shifting borders and mass migrations set off by the war continue to shape societies and fuel tensions to this day. For many, the trauma of those years never truly faded, passed down through families and woven into the fabric of national memory. The economic and technological changes unleashed by the war transformed industries, societies, and the very way people lived, setting the stage for both unprecedented prosperity and new forms of competition. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of World War II is the reminder of how quickly the world can descend into chaos and how fragile peace can be. The choices made by leaders, the courage of individuals, and the consequences of unchecked hatred all serve as warnings for future generations. As we look back, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. Could the war have been prevented? Did the world truly learn from its mistakes? And what will it take to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again? The story of World War II is not just history, it's a mirror, reflecting both the darkness and the light within us all. And as long as we remember, perhaps we can keep the lessons alive, shaping a future where peace is more than just a hope, but a reality we build together.